Ashcombe Hall, the autumn after Princess Elaine died. A housekeeper named Margaret was clearing out a wardrobe nobody had touched in months when her hand found something wedged behind a drawer that wasn't supposed to open. It was a letter. It wasn't addressed to the public. It wasn't addressed to history. It was addressed to her sons, and Margaret was never supposed to be the one to find it. Ashcombe Hall keeps its secrets the way old houses do, in the seams of the floorboards, in wardrobes nobody empties quickly, in drawers built 2 centuries ago by carpenters who never imagined what people would eventually hide inside them. After Elaine died, the house went through a strange kind of mourning. Nobody said much out loud. The staff moved quietly through her old rooms, the way people do when a space still feels occupied even though it isn't. For months, her private quarters were left almost exactly as she'd kept them, not out of policy, but because nobody had the heart to be the one who changed them first. Margaret had worked at Ashcombe for 11 years by then. She wasn't senior staff, not in the way that mattered for decisions about the house. She didn't sit in on discussions about the family. She wasn't consulted on anything beyond the physical upkeep of the room she was responsible for. But she was trusted. She'd been the one assigned to Elaine's wing for the better part of 6 years, which meant she'd learnt things about the princess that never appeared in any paper. She knew which perfume Elaine wore on the days she was dreading something. She knew the princess kept a particular blanket on the end of her bed that had nothing to do with the house's decor and everything to do with comfort. She knew Elaine sometimes sat by the window for long stretches doing nothing at all, and that on those days it was better not to knock. When Elaine died, Margaret had been the one who cried in the linen cupboard where nobody could see her. She never told anyone that. It didn't feel like her grief to claim. Autumn came, and with it came the practical, unglamorous work that death always leaves behind. The family had decided quietly that certain rooms needed to be sorted, not emptied, not erased, just organised, catalogued, made sense of. It was the kind of task nobody wanted to be assigned and everybody understood needed doing. Margaret was given Elaine's dressing room. She was told gently but clearly that anything personal should be set aside for the family and anything belonging to the house should be catalogued as usual. It sounded simple. It wasn't. She started with the easy things, the dresses, the shoes, the boxes of accessories that had accumulated over years of formal occasions. She worked slowly, out of respect more than necessity, folding things the way Elaine herself would have wanted them folded, the way she'd watched her do it 100 times when the princess preferred to pack her own weekend case rather than have someone do it for her. It was late in the afternoon, the light already turning that particular shade of grey that autumn brings early, when Margaret reached the wardrobe against the far wall, an old piece older than most of the furniture in the room, with a bottom drawer that had stuck for years. Everyone who worked in that wing knew about the drawer. It required a specific angle, a slight lift before the pull, or it wouldn't budge. Margaret did what she always did. Lifted, pulled, and this time the whole drawer came free of its track entirely, sliding out further than it should have, and revealing a gap behind it that had never been visible before. She almost didn't look. She almost just pushed the drawer back into place and moved on, because it wasn't her job to go searching through the architecture of the room, only to sort what was already in front of her. But something about the gap, the way it looked deliberate, the way old furniture doesn't usually leave space like that by accident, made her pause. She reached in. Her fingers found paper before anything else. An envelope, slightly yellowed at the edges, tucked flat against the back panel of the wardrobe in a spot that would have taken real effort to reach. Not the kind of place something ends up by accident, but the kind of place something ends up because someone wanted it hidden well enough that it would only be found if someone was looking, or if fate intervened in exactly the way it just had. She pulled it out and looked at it in the fading light. On the front, in handwriting she recognized instantly. She'd seen it on notes, on cards, on the occasional instruction left for staff, were 2 words, "For my boys." Margaret stood very still. She was not a woman prone to dramatics. 11 years in service teaches you the discipline of staying composed no matter what's placed in front of you, and she held on to that discipline now, even as her heart moved somewhere it hadn't been in months. She turned the envelope over in her hands. It was sealed. It had never been opened, which meant Elaine had written it, hidden it, and never told anyone where it was. Not her sons, not her closest friends, not the staff who managed nearly every other detail of her private life. She thought about calling for someone immediately. She thought about simply setting it aside with the other personal items destined for the family, letting whoever handled that process decide what came next. But some instinct, the same instinct that had made her check the gap in the first place, told her this letter needed to go directly into the right hands, not through the ordinary channel of boxes and inventories and secretaries sorting through a dead woman's belongings. She sat down on the edge of the stripped bed, the envelope resting in her lap, and allowed herself for just a moment to feel the full weight of what she was holding. Then she stood, smoothed her apron, and went to find someone who would know what to do. She didn't go to the family estate manager, whose job it technically was to handle exactly this kind of discovery. She didn't go to the senior housekeeper, who outranked her and would have expected to be informed first as a matter of protocol. She went instead to the one person in that house whose judgment she trusted completely on anything involving Elaine, an older groundskeeper named Thomas, who'd worked at Ashcombe even longer than she had, and who'd been quietly, unofficially close to the princess in the particular way staff sometimes become close to the people they serve, through years of small kindnesses that never made it into any official record. She found him near the stables, finishing up for the day. She didn't say much, just that she'd found something and that she didn't know what to do with it. He took one look at her face and set down what he was doing. She showed him the envelope. He read the 2 words on the front, and something in his expression changed the way expressions change when a person is confronted with proof of something they'd only ever suspected. "She wrote to them," he said quietly. "It wasn't a question." "I think so," Margaret said. "I haven't opened it, I wouldn't." "No," he agreed. "You wouldn't." He looked at the envelope for a long moment, the way you look at something that suddenly feels much heavier than its actual weight. "This isn't ours to decide anything about," he said finally. "But it's not the estate's business either. Not the lawyers, not anyone who'll want to catalogue it and file it away with the rest of her things like it's furniture." Margaret felt something in her chest ease slightly, hearing him say out loud the thing she hadn't quite let herself think. "So what do? We take it to the only person who'd know what she actually wanted," he said. "Not what's proper, what she wanted." They both understood immediately who he meant. Not the prince, Elaine's former husband, who would handle it correctly and formally, and without any of the tenderness the moment seemed to require. Not the family's legal advisors, who would see it as an asset to be assessed rather than a mother's private words to her children. There was only one person at Ashcombe whose relationship to Elaine's memory carried enough weight and enough discretion to be trusted with something like this: the Dowager Duchess, the family matriarch who had, in her own complicated and understated way, cared more about protecting what remained of Elaine than anyone gave her credit for. They went together, Margaret carrying the envelope wrapped carefully in a clean cloth, as though the paper itself might bruise. They found the Dowager Duchess in her private sitting room, going through correspondence of her own, the fire low and the room quiet in the particular way rooms are quiet when someone very deliberate occupies them. She looked up when they entered, and something in her face told them she understood immediately that this wasn't a routine visit. "What is it?" she said. Not really a question, more an instruction to explain quickly and without preamble, which was exactly how she preferred difficult things delivered to her. Margaret stepped forward and, with hands that weren't quite steady, held out the cloth. The Dowager Duchess set down what she'd been holding and took it, unwrapping it with the same careful attention Margaret had used. When she saw the envelope, when she read the 2 words written across the front in handwriting she clearly recognized as well, something crossed her face that neither Margaret nor Thomas had ever seen there before. It wasn't shock exactly. It was closer to grief arriving late, the way it sometimes does, years after the funeral, triggered by something small and unbearable. "Where?" she said quietly. "Behind the bottom drawer in her wardrobe, ma'am," Margaret said. "It came loose while I was clearing the room. I don't think anyone was meant to find it. Not like this." The Dowager Duchess turned the envelope over slowly in her hands, the way a person handles something they're afraid might disappear if they move too quickly. "It's sealed," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I didn't open it." "Good," the Dowager Duchess said, and there was something almost fierce in the way she said it. "You did exactly right." She sat with it for a long moment, the fire cracking softly in the silence, Margaret and Thomas standing near the door, unsure whether they were meant to leave or stay. Finally, the Dowager Duchess looked up at them both. "Does anyone else know about this?" "No, ma'am," Margaret said. Just the two of us. And now you. Keep it that way, she said. For now. She looked down at the envelope again, at the words "for my boys," and something in her posture softened in a way it rarely did in front of staff. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing this to me rather than putting it through the estate. You understood something important most people wouldn't have." Margaret felt an unexpected sting behind her eyes and blinked it back the way she'd trained herself to over 11 years of keeping her composure in rooms that weren't hers to feel things in. "She was kind to me," she said simply. "I only wanted to do right by her." The Dowager Duchess nodded slowly.
"You did?"
That should have been the end of it. A discovery, quietly and properly handled, passed into the hands of someone who could decide what came next with the discretion the moment required. But there was a complication neither Margaret nor Thomas could have anticipated, and it arrived less than a week later, in the form of a conversation that reached Margaret second-hand through one of the junior staff who'd overheard something she wasn't meant to hear. Word had somehow reached the estate's legal office that a personal item belonging to the late princess had been discovered among her effects. Nobody knew exactly how, perhaps a slip from someone who'd noticed the Dowager Duchess's unusual mood that week, perhaps simple household gossip finding its way through the wrong channel, the way it always eventually does in houses full of people who notice everything and say nothing directly. But the office had heard enough to ask formally, through the estate manager, whether any items found during the clearing of the princess's rooms had been properly logged and passed through the correct inventory process, a process that existed, ostensibly, to protect the family's interests, but that would have meant the letter passing through hands far removed from anyone who actually loved her. Margaret heard about the inquiry with a cold feeling settling in her stomach. Thought immediately of the letter, of the 2 words on the front of the envelope, of what it would mean for something written for my boys to end up catalogued in a filing system alongside jewelry appraisals and furniture inventories. She went straight to Thomas. "They're asking about it," she said. "The lawyers. Someone's talked." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Does she know?" "I don't know. I think we need to tell her just in case." They found the Dowager Duchess again, this time with more urgency than the first visit, and told her what they'd heard, that the estate's legal office had gotten wind of a discovered item and was asking, formally now, for it to go through the proper channel. The Dowager Duchess listened without any visible alarm, which Margaret would later realise was itself remarkable given what was actually at stake. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment, considering. "Let them ask," she said finally. "Ma'am," Margaret said, "the letter is already accounted for." The Dowager Duchess said, "It has been logged, in my private records, as a personal item recovered and held pending delivery to the appropriate family members. That is entirely true and entirely sufficient for any inventory the estate's office cares to conduct. What is not going to happen," she continued, and her voice took on the particular steel Margaret had heard her use only rarely, in moments when something mattered enough to draw it out, "is a letter a mother wrote to her sons passing through a legal filing system to be assessed, copied, and stored in a vault alongside the good silver. That is not what it is. That is not what it will become. But if they insist—" Thomas started. "They won't insist for long," the Dowager Duchess said, "because I am going to inform them, personally, that the matter has already been resolved to my satisfaction, and that any further inquiry into the personal correspondence of my late daughter-in-law will need to go through me directly, and will not be well received." She looked at them both. "I have spent a great many years learning exactly how much weight my word carries in this house, and in the wider family. I intend to use every bit of it here." What happened over the following days took place almost entirely out of Margaret's sight. In rooms and conversations she wasn't privy to. A phone call here, a quiet conversation there, the particular machinery by which someone with enough authority simply makes a problem stop existing without ever having to raise their voice. Whatever the Dowager Duchess said to the estate's legal office, it worked. The inquiry didn't come again. No one asked Margaret or Thomas anything further. The letter, as far as any official record was concerned, had already been handled. It was nearly 3 weeks later when Margaret learned, through Thomas, what had ultimately happened to it. The Dowager Duchess had waited deliberately, Thomas said, though he didn't know exactly why, until both of Elaine's sons were at Ashcombe together, which happened rarely enough that it clearly wasn't a coincidence. She'd asked to see them privately without explanation, and had given them the letter herself, still sealed exactly as Margaret had found it. Nobody outside that room would ever know precisely what the letter said. That was, everyone agreed without needing to discuss it directly, exactly as it should be. But something in the way the two brothers carried themselves in the days afterward, quieter, gentler with each other than usual, the way people are after being handed something they didn't know they needed, told the staff who'd known Elaine that whatever their mother had written had reached them exactly the way she'd intended, years later than planned, but not too late. Margaret never spoke of it again, not even to the other staff who asked, carefully, whether anything unusual had turned up while she was clearing the princess's rooms. She always said the same thing. Just old dresses, she'd say, nothing that mattered to anyone but her. It wasn't quite a lie. It was the kind of discretion Elaine herself would have appreciated, the kind that protected something precious by simply declining to discuss it at all. Margaret and Thomas have never spoken about this publicly. This particular version of events is, after all, fiction, but the shape of it echoes something true about grief and the things people leave behind without meaning to, or meaning to entirely too much. In real life, people who write letters they never send often do it for exactly this reason, not because they don't want the words to be read, but because they can't bear to be there when they are. The staff who witnessed it, in this story anyway, understood exactly what they'd found and exactly what it deserved. Not a filing system, not an inventory number, just the right hands and enough patience to make sure it got there. A letter in a wardrobe hidden well enough that only chance could find it. And it reached the people it was written for because a housekeeper trusted her instincts over her instructions, and the one person whose word carried final weight in that house made certain nothing stood in the way. That's the story. Whether or not anything like it ever happened in any real family, it's the kind of thing that happens more often than people realize. Not with princesses and duchesses, but with ordinary people, ordinary wardrobes, ordinary grief. Someone leaves something behind, meaning for it to be found eventually by exactly the right person. And somebody, eventually, has to decide whether to honor that or to let it become something else entirely.